I make a lot of videos about Assassin's Creed, and the fan base surrounding that franchise is contentious to say the least. In my last AC video titled "When Did Assassin's Creed Get Bad?", there was at least one argument in the comments for why every single game in the series was the one that ruined the franchise. Even Rogue, which literally came out at the same time as Unity as a borderline companion game, and still managed to stand out as the downfall of the entire series to at least one viewer. Especially now that some of the more recent games have added a variety of new mechanics to fit an RPG-light spin, I hear one criticism constantly: that the new games never should have been called Assassin's Creed due to how different they are from the previous games. That line of thinking is common these days. A phrase I hear all the time is, "It was a good game, but a bad blank game," whenever franchises start breaking from their established norms. For example, Assassin's Creed Odyssey got a ton of hate online and a ton of love online when it came out, and it seems like a lot of people rationalize that by explaining that the ideas in the game were fun, but incongruent with what makes an Assassin's Creed game an Assassin's Creed game to them. That idea got me thinking, to what extent should a game franchise be allowed to change? Is there a level to which too much creative liberty with the original idea of an IP should relegate it to spin-off status? Assassin's Creed is far from being the only series that begs this question. Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, Fallout, and many other franchises are coming out with new entries that look nothing like what fans fell in love with in the first place. The interesting thing, however, is that general fan reception to each has varied very widely, with some being beloved for their alterations to the framework, and others being reviled. That's why in this video I want to take a closer look at that idea. How do franchises balance creating innovative games without alienating fans, and what standards are fans using to determine their success? If you like the video and want to support me further, or if you just want to be in the credits of my next video, I do have a Patreon link in the description, and you're free to check that out if you would like. Otherwise, let's talk about the idea of a game being a good game, but a bad blank game. One of the biggest questions at play is as follows: how can a series maintain a sense of identity while still being willing to make huge changes to its formula? When discussing franchises that have embraced radical change over the years, I can think of no better example than Final Fantasy. Now personally, I am very excited to pick up Final Fantasy 16 this summer, and it is shaping up to be one of the biggest games of 2023. It also looks nothing like traditional Final Fantasy. Now, even saying that, you have to note that Final Fantasy is a long-running franchise with over 100 titles if you count spin-offs. Nailing down a true formula for Final Fantasy is impossible. But there was a time in the 80s and 90s when a specific type of experience could be expected. The games would evolve a lot over the years, but Final Fantasy I set up a lot of the core mechanics that would last all the way up through FF10. Turn-based combat, or a variation of it, open exploration, and deep party management mechanics. For many people, turn-based combat and party management are the bread and butter of Final Fantasy. That is why some people have not been on board with the fact that Final Fantasy 16 is a character action game, with a combat system in the vein of Devil May Cry and only a single character to play as instead of a full-blown party. To say this game isn't drawing a lot of hype would be an outright lie, but it is also impossible to pretend that there isn't a sizable audience lamenting the loss of what came before, as the franchise takes yet another step away from what made the series a staple of the SNES and PSX eras. That being said, one reason I wanted to start with Final Fantasy is that here, this isn't a new argument. 16 is far from being the first game to make radical changes to the formula. And in fact, I would argue that innovation and transformation are just as much keys to Final Fantasy's DNA as any of its individual gameplay mechanics. Since FF10 in 2001, the series has branched out a ton. We've gotten 2 successful MMOs, significant real-time combat inclusions, and dozens upon dozens of spin-offs ranging from third-person shooters to chocobo racing games to mobile microtransaction farms. Looking at a game like Final Fantasy XIV, it's easy to see how a significant portion of the Final Fantasy fanbase could be entirely uninterested in an MMO that they could sink upwards of 1,000 hours into, in contrast of the 50-hour games that they could just sit at home and chill with in the good old days. But as a fan of the job system, medieval settings, and player freedom, I can identify more of the soul of what I love about Final Fantasy in 14 than I can in iconic games like 7 or even 10. When we talk about franchises that mean different things to different people, Final Fantasy is one of the best possible examples. Turn-based or ATB gameplay hasn't been the norm in Final Fantasy since the turn of the millennium. Medieval settings haven't been a constant since the 90s, and party mechanics are changing constantly with every game. Now, I do want to make it clear, I'm not saying all of this to imply that you can't criticize Final Fantasy for straying from its roots. Turn-based games are admittedly not as popular in the West as they once were, and it makes sense to be hurt by the fact that a pioneer in the world of turn-based RPGs has morphed into something so different. Square Enix is still making fantastic turn-based RPGs that do well domestically, so it's understandable to feel like the company is trying to cater to the West with an IP that happens to do well here. If you feel like the series was better when it had more of a focus on the mechanics that made it tick at the height of its popularity, as many people do, then it makes total sense to advocate for that. Change can be a scary thing, and that kind of reaction doesn't just happen when things go more mainstream. It can happen the opposite direction as well. The Yakuza series, which is now Like a Dragon, recently shifted from its brawler-style combat to a turn-based system, and while some thought it was relegated to a one-off at first, as fans tend to say they would prefer when things like this happen, it was later confirmed that its success has meant that turn-based combat is the future of Like a Dragon as a franchise. Once again, reactions are mixed. Most of what I have seen has been positive, but change means that people are going to make their voices heard when they don't like something. It really isn't so much that the mechanics themselves are what are being criticized, so much as the idea of change itself. Regardless of whether a series is trying something new and quirky, or instead changing to keep up with modern player preferences, changes are always going to be met with voices that wish things had remained familiar. But, in my experience, I do want to say I think these arguments with Like a Dragon have been less frequent than the ones you might see in Final Fantasy. Personally, I believe that's because it is the opposite of Final Fantasy when it comes to its policy on change. Now, in order to say a game fails to live up to a franchise's identity, you have to be able to define what that identity is. In Like a Dragon, that's not a difficult thing to do because the games are so similar, and, importantly, a lot of people wouldn't point to the combat as one of its primary defining features. The exploration, fun characters and quests, and wacky minigames have always taken precedence, giving the team the wiggle room to mess with the combat while retaining a majority of the franchise's most popular mechanics. On the other hand, I am really excited that Final Fantasy XVI will have Moogles and dragons and dragoons, and that doesn't mean that people can't also wish that it had a party system. And heck, there are probably people out there who are upset that Clive won't be getting all of his abilities by beating strangers at Triple Triad. While a majority of people would probably not consider combat to be the soul of Like a Dragon, what exactly makes a Final Fantasy game is much looser, and so it makes sense that some people who define it by its turn-based combat would turn their nose away from FF16, while those who define it more by a medieval fantasy setting and bombastic summoning systems would feel right at home. Going back to the argument of a game being good on its own but a bad representative of its franchise, I think Final Fantasy is a great example of a series where that argument has no real place. I mean, FF6 is widely regarded as one of the best Final Fantasy games of all time, and it had 14 playable characters and more mechs, which definitely wasn't the norm at that time. Fans of the series have been debating all of its many changes for years, but at the core of the fan base seems to be the understanding that while it makes total sense to wish the series had stayed truer to its golden age, anyone claiming that FF has a singular identity that needs to be followed is being silly, because the series has been built on big transformations for such a long time. The fans of this series generally do a good job of not conflating big deviations from the formula with whether or not an entry is a real Final Fantasy game, just because it may not mesh with some perceived idea of what the franchise is allowed to be. And I think that's because Final Fantasy fans understand better than most how fluid identity can be when it comes to video games. But with that in mind, Final Fantasy is an anthology, and that gives it the space to change. What do we learn from franchises that make similarly extreme changes, but don't have the luxury of being expected to have a new setting and mechanics with every entry? In Resident Evil 1, I creeped through the same quiet halls over and over again, getting more and more proficient at handling the obstacles in my way every time I returned. I learned how to manage resources and take down zombies, but just one enemy could spell the end of my run, making the limited view of the fixed camera angles increasingly tense. In Resident Evil 8, a 9-foot-tall lady turns into a dragon, and I shoot her out of the sky in first person. What the heck happened there? And more importantly, why doesn't it feel that out of place in this series? A lot of that stems from the shift that occurred when Resident Evil 4 came out. Given that the RE4 remake just came out and is getting rave reviews, it's worth looking into why it has been so successful despite looking so little like the original game. RE was not without its deviations in the RE1 through Code Veronica era, but usually you found yourself exploring a non-linear zone, almost Metroidvania style, picking up new tools along the way that would allow you to slowly unlock more of the map while you tried to manage scarce resources. RE4 was much more action-oriented, eschewing the methodical and campy horror of its predecessors for over-the-shoulder, campy action. Gameplay was now linear and mission-based, completely transforming the basic gameplay experience. Now it would be a lie to say that nobody complained, especially after a more traditional version of Resident Evil 4 was shown off at an earlier presentation. I want to show you a couple passages from a 2011 Eurogamer article reflecting on RE4. Now before I show you this, I want to remind you that debate is a good thing, and this video exists to be part of that debate. Just because you may not like what a person said in a 12-year-old article, please don't try to harass this person. I won't show their name, but I know this stuff is easy to find online these days, so once again, don't bother a person over a valid opinion they had about a video game you played as a child. Anyhow, here is one quote from the article. Resident Evil 4 elevates the accessible action parts and dumbs down the bits that made you think. It's what happens when a gamer series is rejigged for a mainstream audience and it isn't true to its roots. Does that sound familiar? How about another one? RE4 is not a Resident Evil game, and that's the one thing it should have been, above all else. It's the best example of the worst way to update a big franchise. Discard the features which define the brand in the name of appealing to the mainstream, while retaining just enough superficial consistency to appease players who don't bother looking beneath the surface. These arguments sound a lot like what you might hear these days in a series like Assassin's Creed, and while it's kind of weird to hear it for a game as popular as RE4, it does show that no franchise is above that type of criticism from traditionalists. However, compared to other games in this video, you hear that type of talk a lot less. This happened in large part for one specific reason. RE4 is a fantastic game. It revolutionized third-person video games in general, and so complaints about its distance from its horror roots are present, but largely drowned out by the near universal praise it got for its innovation as a piece of art. The person who wrote this article is right. In many ways, the series did become shallower. Exploration was much less important, and you didn't need to draw out a map or rely on memory a whole lot to get through the game due to its mission-based focus. However, the mechanics were so innovative, and the game so polished, that people were generally still thrilled with what they got because it was exactly what it wanted to be. God of War did almost the exact opposite in 2018 when it reset fan expectations by taking its linear character action framework and turning it into a semi-open experience where exploration, loot, and build variety were front and center. Obviously, there are once again people who don't prefer this new style, but the overwhelming love the last two God of War games have gotten has all but nullified the chances that any casual fan will ever even hear those voices. Games like this teach us that it really isn't the type of changes you make that matter, as Resident Evil and God of War went in almost opposite directions. If your game is the pinnacle of quality, it can really be whatever you want it to be, and fans will take to it. Obviously, that is a very high bar to clear, but we see how fans react when that quality diminishes. Take RE5 and RE6, two games that mostly follow in the vein of 4 as opposed to the older games. These games continued down the action route but were heavily criticized upon release. The games may have reduced the classic horror elements even more, but the real problem was that they generally just weren't as good as RE4. RE5's less interesting world design and poor companion AI, and RE6's general lack of quality in a lot of departments had fans yearning for a return to form. And so at that point, Capcom went back to the drawing board and took things back to the basics. RE7 was the return to form people were looking for, and outside of a new first-person perspective, it was, by and large, a huge homage to the original Resident Evil. When it comes to what fans want from their games, RE shows us that people are willing to accept a ton of change, so long as those changes are as close to being undeniably excellent as possible. But if you slip up, they will demand a full reset. These days, just as many people associate RE with linear, over-the-shoulder action as they do with open-ended exploration, if not more. That means when we get slow, non-linear horror like RE7, the fans are happy. But when we get much faster-paced action like RE4 Remake, they're happy too, because both styles have come to define Resident Evil despite being so radically different in some ways. Very few franchises have pulled that off. It is unfair to use Resident Evil as a standard for other games to aspire to, because it is so incredibly difficult to transform your franchise and still have people buy into it. But if the team behind RE4 hadn't taken the risks they had, gaming as a medium would have suffered for it. That being said, worldwide acclaim still doesn't absolve a game from criticism, especially when the formula it deviates from had become cemented in gaming history even more than a series like Resident Evil. The Legend of Zelda is video game royalty like nothing else I've discussed yet. Since 1987, it has been releasing critically acclaimed masterpieces that have shaken up the industry on a regular basis. However, they did find themselves running into a very similar criticism to the Assassin's Creed series, the complaint of stagnation. Now, there are levels to this, and the repetition of AC games coming out year after year with the same assets is different from Zelda games coming out years apart but relying on a tried-and-true formula. However, that distinction doesn't change the fact that, for some people, Zelda had started to become a little more predictable than they would like. That's how we ended up with Breath of the Wild, a game that, 30 years after the release of the original, would prove that the series still had the capacity to sit at the very top of the industry. Breath of the Wild turned not only the Zelda franchise on its head, but open-world games as a whole. It brought a new level of joy and excitement to open-world exploration, and it brought the already venerated series to new heights. Breath of the Wild is one of the most celebrated games of all time. However, it also seems to face more criticism from fans for its deviation from the past than a series like Resident Evil seems to. There were iconic components of the Zelda franchise that were notably absent or scaled down in Breath of the Wild, among the most obvious being the dungeons, which were arguably the most memorable aspect of many of the best games in the series, like Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. There were a lot of other changes too, like Link needing to cycle through dozens of different weapons on the go and manage his food intake, and in many ways it was similar to the changes that Assassin's Creed went through, albeit on a different level. Stagnation had led to innovation, and innovation had led to a level of discontent. However, the big difference is that Breath of the Wild was heralded as one of the greatest games of all time, while no Assassin's Creed game has ever really held that distinction. Once again, success and quality can make people accept a lot of change. But why isn't it as universally accepted as with RE4? Both games are in the conversation for greatest games of all time, so what is it about Breath of the Wild that has led so many more voices to resist change? Obviously, there are many reasons, but a big one is that Zelda had baked its formula so firmly in the gaming landscape that it was hard for a lot of people to accept any deviation at all. Since Link to the Past, we've had over a dozen games following a pretty clear formula, and while the stagnation was clearly getting to some people, each game was still beautifully crafted and clearly got a lot of resources at Nintendo. In contrast, prior to RE4 we had an absolute ton of spin-offs, but only 4 mainline Resident Evil games when you include Code Veronica, as you should. Even though many would consider Ocarina of Time to be the peak of 3D Zelda for a long time after its release, it was still expected that each subsequent entry would give us increasingly complex and in-depth dungeons. Game Maker's Toolkit makes great videos about game design, and his video series on the dungeon design of Zelda games showcases how unique and interesting the franchise's approach to dungeon crafting was. Even if you could reliably expect a gimmick boss that you had to hookshot to, or at least one annoying swimming puzzle in each game, the dungeons kept a lot of people interested, even in the series' less lofty heights. Breath of the Wild was decidedly less focused on that, and it made total sense that people would be upset by it. But then that brings up the title question. Is Breath of the Wild a bad Zelda game for not prioritizing the tried and true aspects of the formula, like dungeons and a linear storyline? Was nailing down the science of collecting compasses, maps, and keys in Ocarina of Time the core of Zelda? Or could it be argued that scouring the sky for suit delivery clients, or zipping around Termina to find people to console about their impending deaths, or charting every single island in the Great Sea was more in line with the soul of what Zelda was trying to be? The truth is, there's no right answer there, and those who prefer the more formulaic approach and those who are in it for the exploration and adventure are both right, and they probably dip into each other's camps quite a bit. But it does seem that Zelda games had become so reliable when it came to providing certain experiences that it took a lot less change to make people feel alienated. If Breath of the Wild lacks what you wanted in a Zelda game, as it did for so many, then it makes sense to make your voice heard. But at the same time, the jump from "this isn't what I like" to "this isn't Zelda" is a pretty big one. Tears of the Kingdom just came out, and while I won't go in-depth into the game since I obviously haven't had a lot of time to process it, it clearly wants to build off Breath of the Wild. There's a level to which old-school ideas and mechanics are being called back to more than the previous game, but the core of the game is about igniting the sense of exploration that the very first entry provided for players back in the 80s, above creating new, complex dungeon layouts to explore like in most of the other 3D Zeldas. Whether they succeed is up to you, but it's obvious from playing these games that Eiji Aonuma and his team are not trying to create something new that can piggyback off the Zelda name, but instead trying to make the game that best encapsulates what Zelda is to them. And it's okay to disagree with them about what the franchise's most important components are, but to claim they don't understand Zelda and are no longer making Zelda with these last two games is a tougher argument for me to accept. But with a franchise like this, it's easy to see where that argument comes from. Just as Final Fantasy has become defined by change, Zelda had become defined by formula. Some saw Breath of the Wild's shake-ups as blasphemy, others saw them as desperately needed. But one thing was clear. With a formula as iconic as Zelda's, no amount of critical acclaim could have ever risen above those who missed the familiar. So far, I've been talking about franchises where change paid off. Final Fantasy has had some great titles in the last 20 years, and RE4 and Breath of the Wild were medium-defining pieces of art. But there are many examples that fall in the vein of RE6, where a game was poorly received and thus demanded return to form. Discussing Ubisoft further, we could look at Splinter Cell. The series was, at one time, seen as the yin to Metal Gear's yang. It was the slow, methodical side of stealth action that balanced out the wacky sci-fi stealth of Metal Gear. For a short period between 02 and 05, Splinter Cell was one of the best stealth experiences out there for hardcore stealth fans. But then in 06 we got Double Agent, and it was very much in line with what came before, but it just wasn't that well loved, and in response Ubisoft took some drastic measures with the sequel. Splinter Cell Conviction was a whole new approach to stealth. Most mechanics were simplified to a binary. Instead of a light meter, you were either hidden or you weren't. Instead of sound levels, you were either crouched and silent or running and loud. Ghosting missions was now not the intended way to play, with Sam Fisher now scaling walls, chaining assassinations, and striking from the darkness in a very aggressive form of stealth that didn't really resemble what we had gotten in the past. There was a time partway through the PS3 360 era where stealth games simply started to get less popular, and Splinter Cell attempted to address that with more action-oriented and character-driven gameplay. The game wasn't panned, but it just didn't draw a ton of interest. It has become the black sheep of the franchise because so many of its creative decisions felt like a response to the market, not to a desire for new creative ideas. In that same era, we saw Hitman Absolution, a game that would take the open-ended gameplay of the older Hitmans and streamline it into a much more linear and beginner-friendly style of game. The game failed to reach a new audience, and the fans let the devs know that this more casual style of Hitman wasn't really what they wanted. Finally, let's take a look at a slightly different example, Devil May Cry. Now, if you aren't a Devil May Cry fan, you could easily see DMC side by side with any other entry and think it doesn't look nearly as different as some of the other examples in this video. However, the narrative and themes of this game clashed so completely with what fans wanted that many came to disregard the game entirely. They called this new, angstier Dante, Dante, to signify that he was not their Dante, and this was not their Devil May Cry. One thing all of these games have in common is that fans felt that they actively disrespected what came before and wanted to signify that the past was not going to matter in new entries. It was not an evolution of what came before, but instead a replacement, or at least it was seen as such, either to cater to a new, more casual fan base, or to try and stir up excitement for an IP in the West. If fans believe you are chasing trends instead of fostering creativity, they're going to let you know. Now, it's important to note that these were not universally hated games. Think back to my notes on RE4 when I brought up the article that criticized the game for catering to the lowest common denominator and forgetting about its fans. Almost any time a game makes changes to modernize itself one way or another, that kind of rhetoric gets thrown out there. Judging by the fact that this argument can vary between being a very strong minority, like with RE4, or a heavy majority, like with the 3 games I've mentioned here, we can see how subjective that line of thinking is. There are some games, like the more recent Avengers title, where a vast majority of fans will see the primary design decisions as pushed by cash and not creativity, but it isn't always so clear-cut. With games that make big design changes, it really isn't a question of whether or not people will feel alienated and accuse the devs of chasing cash instead of creativity. The real question is what percentage of people will feel that way, and that is what really sets games like RE4 apart from games like these. If the critical consensus is overwhelmingly that changes weren't made in the player's best interest, then the hope is that the devs will take a step back and listen to criticism. In the case of these franchises, I'd say that is exactly what happened. When Splinter Cell Blacklist came out, it was not as hardcore as what came before, but it added way more stealth options, improved the mission design, and was all around a better game than Conviction. It still did retain Conviction's mark and execute mechanics and speedy climbing, giving players options regardless of what they liked best. Hitman went back to basics entirely, and the World of Assassination trilogy that came out over the past few years has had some of the best and most creative stealth in the medium. And Devil May Cry scrapped its reboot and returned to the old timeline, with what many believe to be the pinnacle of Devil May Cry and the genre itself. And interestingly enough, it shows reverence to every game that came before, including DMC, through its callbacks and mechanics. Obviously, Conviction, Absolution, DMC, RE6, and all of these games that didn't hit the mark had great creative minds working on them. But when fans believe that higher-ups are choosing to simplify or streamline a franchise to chase trends instead of following what developers think would be strong evolutions of the IP, they are going to take notice, and they're going to be loud about it. And that's why I wanted to bring up these franchises. When I say we are too quick to condemn change, I don't mean that we should always accept deviations wholeheartedly. There is danger in creating a culture in which developers are not given the opportunity to be creative and take big risks, but that doesn't mean that the risks will always pay off. And when those risks don't pan out, or even actively disrespect what came before, we as fans have the right to be critical so that those problems can be addressed. That is how criticism is supposed to work. I've purposefully chosen examples of games that have either been widely well received or widely poorly received. It's easy to say that a good game is a step in the right direction, and easy to say that a bad game shouldn't be repeated. But that brings me back to Assassin's Creed, a franchise that, however unwilling some commenters may be to admit, is very much in the middle. It has received very valid criticism from fans of the series, while at the same time doing very well among new and old fans alike. I believe the franchises I have mentioned can teach us a lot about how fans react to change. Final Fantasy shows us that being willing to take risks can pay off, and that you can retain a sense of identity even if every game is completely different. Resident Evil shows us that success means more than homogeny, and a good game will sometimes be allowed to break the formula in extreme ways if the experience is fun enough to justify it. Zelda shows us that success has its limits in that respect, and sometimes a formula can be too ingrained in a franchise's identity for people to accept change wholeheartedly. And DMC, Splinter Cell, and Hitman teach us that when the clear consensus is that a franchise has indeed changed for the worse, fan reception can get the series back on track. What makes the Assassin's Creed series so complex is that there isn't really a consensus as to the quality of these new games. Some people see a game like AC Odyssey as the RE4 of the series, a full reset of the mechanics that provided a completely new experience. Some see it as the Splinter Cell Conviction of the series, a maligned attempt to appeal to a more casual audience. Now, successful or not, no Assassin's Creed game has ever attained the level of critical and fan-level praise that a game like RE4 or Breath of the Wild has, and as a result, the negative voices are always going to be much more audible here. So between the two camps, who is right? Well, all of this goes back to the question of how much you can really pin down the identity of a franchise. The idea of Assassin's Creed is a very clear one. A hooded assassin acts as a blade in the crowd, parkouring around urban environments and finding clues for the perfect kill. The problem is the idea of Assassin's Creed has never really been a reality. After AC-1, the focus on assassins and Templars and stealthy assassination set pieces really took a backseat to a cinematic story and a simple mission-based structure. Stealth mechanics have always been subpar, non-urban settings have been explored within the series for over a decade, and the devs rarely create content based around testing your free-running abilities. On top of that, the Assassins and Templars are seemingly groups that, after the first game, Ubisoft has been entirely uninterested in writing about. Almost every protagonist is a lone wolf seeking revenge or redemption or something else that has nothing to do with being an assassin, to the point that you could legitimately cut the organization out of many of the games, including Golden Age titles like Assassin's Creed 2, while barely changing the story. Now I want to make it clear, it makes total sense to want this type of Assassin's Creed game. It's clearly what Ubisoft advertises, or at least what they used to, and a lot of the early mechanics introduced in the series really were one of a kind. As janky and unfinished as Unity's parkour is, it's also the only earnest attempt I've ever seen at a free-running system like this, and as stagnant as the social stealth had become, I haven't ever really seen anyone else try to copy these crowd mechanics. There were a lot of unique ideas that weren't fully fleshed out, but had all the potential in the world, and Ubisoft gave up on them, at least as of Valhalla. And that sucks. I truly do get it as a longtime fan of the series. But can we really fault people for not caring that much about side ejects and manual ledge grabs when so many people just held down high profile and sprint and let Altair auto-climb the entirety of Jerusalem without running into any issues? Can we really say the series should have changed its name to Warrior's Creed, as some of the goofier YouTube comments suggest, when even an average player could brutalize enemies by the dozen in Brotherhood without ever taking damage, whereas even a small group of guards could overwhelm you in the more recent games? Can we really say stealth died in AC4 when Edward had more legitimate stealth assassination sequences in his main story than Ezio got in AC2? Well, yes, we can. That's the whole point of this video. People have different points of view, and there are counter-arguments to everything I just mentioned. But at the core of it, we can also clearly see why some people are so upset, and why some people honestly don't feel like the formula even changed that much at all. Plenty of people come for the beautifully recreated historical settings, and they have been circling maps and doing whatever side content they stumble across since 2010. For some longtime fans, the release of Origins was defined by the lack of social stealth and the less cinematic combat system. For others, it was defined by one of the most gorgeous recreations of an historical setting of all time, along with series-long criticisms that were finally addressed, such as tailing being removed, one-on-one duels becoming a possibility, and instant fail objectives being heavily reduced. Is it such a stretch to believe that some fans could see the new games as an evolution of the formula based on how they played, and not just a replacement of it? And so we may ask, is Assassin's Creed yet another trend-chasing franchise? Some would say that it is, without question. Ubisoft is famously greedy and anti-consumer as a company, so it's not a hard argument to believe. And yet I see the vibrant online community a game like AC Odyssey can have to this day, and the genuine joy surrounding the game that I hadn't really seen in the franchise since Black Flag, and it's clear that these changes really did work for a lot of people. While RE4 was generally praised for its change and DMC was generally disliked, the new AC games truly are polarizing. Like with Zelda, the camps within the Assassin's Creed fanbase have become so divided and sometimes toxic that the discourse never gets that nuance. We're stuck in this unfortunate binary. Either the devs are too greedy and out of touch, or the fans are entitled and too stubborn to accept change. Again, identifying positives in these games doesn't invalidate how you may feel about the series if you think it lacks the things that matter to you. A lot of people feel that way, and it is by no means the wrong way to feel. In many ways, the series is less unique than it was. But to say that gamers who enjoy the new games are fake fans who just don't understand Assassin's Creed simply isn't true. Many fans feel alienated and disrespected, and many feel like the new games are the peak of the franchise, and because of that, Ubisoft is split as well. Their bizarre approach to the future, in which they give us a little bit of everything, has me skeptical, but I won't actually judge it until I see what titles it bears. Odyssey is no Breath of the Wild, nor is it a DMC. It is divisive, and perhaps some people would see that as a fatal flaw in of itself, even if I would disagree. And so we are left in a position where we can totally understand where those who don't recognize the series anymore are coming from, while also clearly seeing that their view of what AC should be is by no means scripture. And that brings me back to the title of this video, and a question that I see all the time. Why didn't Ubisoft just call these new games something else? This divide wouldn't exist if they had just given the new games their own name, right? Is it not better to avoid alienating fans and hurting the feelings of one part of the fan base to appeal to another? Because of all the things I've discussed, I have a problem with that idea. I believe criticism is important, and I believe that criticism of Assassin's Creed is why Mirage is taking things back to basics, which is exactly what should happen if upset voices make up enough of the community, even if Ubisoft isn't fully committing to it. But what would the world of gaming look like if change always meant you needed to create a new IP? Well, based off of what we've discussed, I think we would have been without some of the most influential games of all time, and the landscape of the industry would probably look very different. Because these changes were built on the backs of established IPs, we have good reason to believe that games like RE4 or Breath of the Wild simply wouldn't have existed at all. And while criticism of these games is valid, I'd say a pretty vast majority of the gaming world is happy that they exist at all. And so when you take games like DMC, where change didn't work out, games like Odyssey, where opinions are mixed, and games like RE4, where opinions are overwhelmingly positive, we're left with only one clear answer. As far as general opinion goes, change is only as bad as the game it ends up creating. Historically, we know now that there is no such thing as too much change. If there was, Resident Evil would have tanked 20 years ago. There is only change that enough people dislike. DMC wasn't simply complained about because Dante was completely different. It was disliked because he was changed in a way that fans felt disrespected by. In truth, if they had knocked it out of the park with his characterization in that game, even if he was still nothing like the old games, chances are we would have gotten a sequel to DMC instead of a return to the old timeline. Similarly, had Conviction and Absolution blown people away with their mechanics, then linear and more casual stealth games could have remained the norm. But because of fan reception, that didn't happen. Because that is how criticism works. Companies try new things, and fans decide if they want those things in the future. I think we have to get rid of this gatekeeping narrative that fans of the scary new thing simply didn't understand what made the old thing so good. There are people who regularly get sub-2-hour runs in OG RE1 who could also tell you the optimal route through RE4. There are people who cut their teeth on Ocarina of Time who felt compelled to collect every Korok seed in Breath of the Wild and intend to do it again in Tears of the Kingdom. These aren't fake fans. They aren't fans who just don't get it. They're not too young to understand. They're not too immature to comprehend the old games. They're just fans, same as anybody else. If Odyssey should have taken the Assassin's Creed out of its name, then shouldn't RE4 have taken the Resident Evil out of its name? Because at the end of the day, the gameplay loop of that game is arguably much less in line with tradition than what Assassin's Creed has been putting out. And there are plenty of people who do think that way. People who think Metal Gear should have stayed top-down, people who think Pokemon should have stayed 2D, and people who think Resident Evil should have stayed open-ended without exceptions. And there's nothing wrong with that point of view. But I'm making this video because I believe most people don't think like that. I think people like change when it's fun and fits what they want, and they dislike it when it's done poorly or makes them feel alienated. And that is normal, but it shows that change itself isn't the problem. Now, I run the risk of falling into a semantic argument here. To say the lack of themed dungeons feels dull in Zelda is criticizing a specific change. To say a Zelda game needs themed dungeons or else it doesn't get to be a Zelda game is criticizing change itself and is more what I have a problem with. But at the end of the day, those two complaints still target the same gameplay mechanics, so what is the difference? And while that is a valid argument, I think there is a big difference between pointing out something that you want to see changed in the future and claiming that a criticism invalidates a game's position within its own franchise. The problem with being too closed off to change and responding with "call it something else" whenever devs get a little too creative for us is that it discourages innovation. We would have no RE4 with that mindset, no Breath of the Wild, no Fallout New Vegas, no God of War, none of 100 games that shook the industry not just by iterating, but by actively transforming and even replacing aspects of its identity entirely. And sure, sometimes we get Splinter Cell convictions or DMCs, but you know what? That's how risk-taking is supposed to work. Sometimes it pans out, sometimes it doesn't. I am not making this video to encourage you to stop criticizing the things that you dislike, because that is vital to any industry. Even if your only criticism is that a game doesn't cater to your feelings of nostalgia in ways that you hoped, that is valid and you have every right to pose that opinion. But at the same time, criticism is allowed to just be criticism, without the added drama of representing the betrayal of a fan base. If you are okay with RE4 changing everything about its structure as a video game, but not okay with AC Odyssey for changing up things on its end, then maybe Odyssey being too different isn't the problem. Maybe you just don't like it. At the end of the day, treating Odyssey as an Assassin's Creed game you dislike will lead to more productive discussions than treating it like it isn't worth acknowledging as an AC game at all, as if it could have nothing to teach future entries despite its popularity. We should criticize these games for what they do wrong, not for having taken major risks at all, because willingness to make radical changes, for all of its misses, has made the industry what it is today, and calling a game a good game, but a bad, whatever franchise game, dismisses that kind of risk-taking entirely. That's all I've got. This was a much more subjective video than I usually make, given that it's just me talking about a comment I see a lot that I wanted to address, but I do appreciate you watching nonetheless. Like I said, if you like the video and you want to support me, I do have a Patreon page, but hopefully I can continue making content like this one way or another. Anyhow, have a great day, and take care of yourself.